For centuries, the Vikings were known as some of the most fearless people in history. They crossed freezing seas, raided powerful kingdoms, discovered distant lands, and built settlements in places where few others dared to live. They seemed almost impossible to stop. But there was one place where the Viking story ended in a mystery: Greenland. Around 1,000 years ago, Norse settlers sailed west across the North Atlantic and established communities on the enormous island. It was one of the most dangerous places they had ever attempted to inhabit. The winters were brutal. The growing season was short. The sea could turn against them without warning. And yet, they survived. They built farms. They raised sheep and cattle. They constructed churches. They traded with Europe. They created a society thousands of miles from the lands their ancestors had called home. For generations, the settlements continued. Then something changed. The ships became fewer. The trade weakened. The settlements became smaller. And eventually, the people were gone. There was no great final battle, no massive invasion, no famous massacre recorded by historians. The Vikings simply disappeared from Greenland, and that is where the mystery begins. To understand what happened, we have to go back to the beginning. Around the end of the 10th century, Norse settlers arrived in Greenland under the leadership of Eric the Red. Eric himself had been exiled from Iceland after a series of violent disputes. Rather than accepting defeat, he sailed west in search of new land. What he found was enormous. Greenland was not the paradise its name might suggest. Most of the island was covered by ice, but along parts of the southern and southwestern coast, there were areas where farming was possible. Eric returned to Iceland and promoted the new land as a place worth settling. Soon, ships began crossing the North Atlantic. Families packed their belongings. Animals were loaded onto wooden ships. Farmers brought tools, seeds, and livestock. They were not simply raiders anymore. They were colonists. They wanted to build a permanent home. The journey itself was dangerous. The North Atlantic was unpredictable, and navigation depended heavily on the sun, stars, currents, and experience of the sailors. But the settlers made it. They established two major areas of Norse settlement, the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement. At their height, thousands of people may have lived across Greenland's Norse communities. They built farms across the valleys. They raised sheep, goats, cattle, and horses. They hunted seals and other animals. They fished the cold waters. They constructed churches and stone buildings. From the outside, it looked like the Vikings had achieved the impossible. They had created a European society at the edge of the known world. But Greenland had a price. Almost everything depended on the environment. The land could not produce enough grain to support the population. The growing season was short. Cattle required enormous amounts of food. And when winter arrived, every mistake became dangerous. The settlers adapted by relying heavily on animals and marine resources. Seals became especially important. They provided meat, fat, skins, and other materials. The ocean was not simply a source of food. It was the lifeline of Greenland's Norse society. And there was another lifeline: trade. The Greenlanders exported valuable products to Europe, including walrus ivory, hides, and other Arctic goods. In exchange, they could obtain timber, iron, grain, and luxury items. This trade connected Greenland to a much larger world, but it also created a weakness. The farther Greenland was from Europe, the more difficult and expensive that connection became. A society living thousands of kilometers from major European markets could survive only if ships continued arriving. For a while, they did, But then Europe began to change. The world that had supported the Greenland settlements was becoming different. Around the same period, the climate of the North Atlantic began shifting. The relatively favorable conditions that had helped the settlers establish themselves would eventually become less predictable. Colder temperatures meant shorter growing seasons. Longer winters meant more food was required for livestock. Ice could make travel more difficult, and storms could prevent ships from reaching Greenland. For a society already living close to the limits of survival, even small environmental changes could have enormous consequences. Imagine living through a Greenland winter 1,000 years ago. There are no modern roads, no supermarkets, no electricity, no emergency services. If your animals die, you lose food. If your crops fail, you have little to replace them. If a ship carrying supplies never arrives, you cannot simply order more. Everything depends on what you have stored before winter begins. The margin between survival and disaster was extremely small. And the problems did not stop with the climate. The wider economy was changing too. Europe gradually developed new sources of luxury materials. Trade routes shifted. The value of some Greenlandic exports declined. Walrus ivory, once highly valuable, faced competition from other materials and sources. If European merchants had less reason to travel all the way to Greenland, the settlements lost one of their most important connections to the outside world. The Vikings had survived isolation before, but isolation combined with economic decline was much more dangerous. There may also have been another problem. The people of Greenland were not living in an empty world. The Arctic was also home to indigenous peoples, including groups associated with the Thule culture. These people were highly adapted to Arctic conditions. They understood the environment in ways the Norse settlers did not necessarily possess. They hunted marine mammals efficiently. They traveled across the landscape using technologies suited to the extreme climate. And eventually, the Norse and indigenous populations came into contact. Exactly how much conflict occurred between them remains debated, but their presence created another layer of pressure on an already isolated society. The Norse had brought a European farming lifestyle to Greenland. The Arctic peoples had developed a very different way of surviving there, and as conditions became harder, adaptability mattered. The people who could move quickly, hunt efficiently, and rely heavily on the sea had advantages. The Norse way of life was more dependent on farms, livestock, and European trade. That difference may have become increasingly important. By the 14th century, the Western settlement appears to have disappeared. Exactly when and why remains uncertain. There was no dramatic final chapter written by a surviving witness. No historian stood there and recorded the last day. One generation was there, then another, and eventually the settlement was empty. The Eastern settlement survived longer, but it too eventually disappeared. By the 15th century, the Norse presence in Greenland had effectively ended, and this is what makes the story so haunting. These people had crossed one of the world's most dangerous oceans. They had built homes in an environment that seemed almost impossible to inhabit. They had survived for centuries. Then somehow, the society collapsed. Their farms were abandoned. Their churches fell silent. Their houses slowly disappeared into the landscape, and the people who had once called Greenland home were gone. But did they really vanish? Or did they simply leave? Did hunger destroy the settlements? Did the climate become too harsh? Did trade collapse? Did disease or conflict play a role? Or was the real answer a combination of all these forces? For centuries, historians could only guess. But modern archaeology has begun to reveal clues, and some of those clues tell us something surprising. The Vikings may not have been destroyed by one catastrophic event. They may have been defeated by something much more powerful, a changing world. And in the next part, we will examine the evidence left behind and the theories surrounding the disappearance of Greenland's Norse settlers, including one possibility that suggests the Vikings themselves may have realized that staying was no longer worth the cost. For centuries, the Norse settlers of Greenland had survived against the odds. They had endured freezing winters, short summers, dangerous seas, and isolation from Europe. But survival had always depended on one thing: balance. The farms needed enough grass, the animals needed enough food, the hunters needed enough seals and walruses, and the ships needed to keep moving between Greenland and Europe. If one part of that system failed, the others could follow. By the 14th century, that balance was beginning to break. One of the most important clues may have been hidden in something that looked almost worthless: a walrus tusk. To the people of medieval Europe, walrus ivory was incredibly valuable. It was used to make religious objects, decorations, luxury goods, and gaming pieces. For Greenland, it was much more than a luxury. It was one of the few valuable products the settlers could export in large quantities. For generations, Greenland's Norse communities had supplied European markets with walrus ivory. At one point, evidence suggests that Greenland had become a major, perhaps dominant, source of walrus ivory reaching Western Europe. That trade helped make the impossible settlement possible, but it also created a dangerous dependency. Greenland had very few resources that Europe desperately needed. It had no forests comparable to those of Scandinavia. Iron was scarce. Grain production was limited. Many necessities had to be imported. The settlers needed ships arriving from Europe, and to pay for those imports, they needed something valuable to send back. Walrus ivory filled that role. But then the European market began to change. Other sources of ivory became more important. Elephant ivory entered European markets in greater quantities. Demand and fashion changed. The price of Greenlandic, walrus, ivory declined. The settlers were now facing a terrible problem. The thing that had made their remote society economically valuable was becoming less valuable, and there was almost nothing else they could replace it with. The answer seemed to be simple: hunt more walruses, but that solution created another problem. The most valuable animals were not always close to the settlements. The Norse hunters had to travel farther north into increasingly dangerous Arctic waters. Archaeological and genetic evidence suggests that later Greenlandic ivory came from walrus populations farther and farther into the high Arctic. The journeys became longer, the conditions became more dangerous, and the rewards became smaller. The Greenlanders were effectively spending more resources to obtain a product that was becoming less valuable. It was a trap. The harder they worked to preserve the old economy, the more vulnerable that economy became. And then the environment began making everything even harder. For a long time, historians believed that a simple cooling climate destroyed the settlements, but the evidence is more complicated. Recent research from lake sediments in southern Greenland suggests that persistent drying may have been particularly important. Less rainfall meant less grass. Less grass meant less food for livestock, and livestock were central to Norse society. Cows, sheep, and goats were not simply animals. They were wealth. They provided meat, milk, wool, hides, and status. A farm with healthy animals could survive a difficult year. A farm that lost its animals could quickly fall into crisis, and the Greenlanders could not simply move somewhere warmer. Their entire society was built around a specific landscape. Their churches were there. Their farms were there. Their ancestors were buried there. Their trade routes were there. Leaving meant abandoning centuries of investment, so they adapted. The archaeological record suggests that their diet changed over time. As farming became more difficult, the settlers relied increasingly on marine resources, particularly seals. This tells us something important. The Vikings were not simply sitting on their farms, waiting for the climate to kill them. They were adapting. They changed what they ate. They changed how they used the landscape. They continued hunting. They continued trading. They continued surviving. But adaptation has limits. Eventually, the question was no longer whether they could survive another difficult winter. The question became whether the entire society was still worth maintaining. And then there was Europe. The Greenlanders depended on a connection that stretched across thousands of kilometers of ocean. But that connection was fragile. Ships could disappear. Storms could destroy them. Sea ice could block routes. Political changes could redirect trade. And European society itself was changing. The Black Death devastated Europe during the 14th century. Norway was hit particularly hard. There is no convincing evidence that the plague wiped out Greenland's population directly, but the catastrophe still mattered. Norway was one of Greenland's most important connections to the outside world. If Norway became poorer, smaller, and less capable of maintaining long-distance trade, Greenland would feel the consequences. A remote settlement could survive isolation for a while, but Greenland's Norse society had become part of an international economic system. When that system weakened, Greenland became increasingly vulnerable. Then another strange clue appeared. The settlers did not seem to leave behind the kind of evidence we might expect from a population that had suddenly died. There was no giant mass grave, no battlefield containing thousands of bodies, no single catastrophic event that clearly explains everything. Instead, there were abandoned farms, empty buildings, churches that eventually fell into ruin. The silence came gradually. This has led some researchers to consider an important possibility. Maybe the Norse did not simply die. Maybe some of them left. Perhaps families abandoned farms that could no longer support them. Perhaps people moved to other parts of the settlement. Perhaps some eventually returned to Iceland, Norway, or elsewhere in Europe. We cannot say exactly how many left, and we cannot say exactly where they went. But the absence of a dramatic final catastrophe is itself significant. The end may have been slow. One farm disappears, then another. A family leaves. Another family stays one more winter. A ship arrives less frequently. Trade becomes weaker. The population declines. And eventually, there are too few people left to maintain the society. This is very different from the popular image of the Vikings simply vanishing overnight. They probably did not disappear in a single moment. Their world slowly became impossible to maintain. But there is another part of the story that makes the mystery even more fascinating. The Norse were not the only people living in Greenland. The Thule Inuit had expanded into Greenland and were highly adapted to Arctic life. They had different technologies, different hunting strategies, different ways of moving across the landscape, and they understood the Arctic environment in ways the Norse settlers may not have. Archaeological evidence indicates that the two populations encountered one another. Exactly what happened between them remains uncertain. There may have been trade, there may have been competition, there may have been conflict, But there is not enough evidence to say that the Inuit simply destroyed the Norse. The reality was probably more complicated. The Inuit were better adapted to a world increasingly dominated by Arctic conditions. The Norse had developed a society based partly on European farming and partly on long-distance trade. As the environment and economy changed, those differences mattered more. The final known evidence of Norse presence in Greenland comes from the 15th century. One of the most famous clues is a wedding recorded at Valsey in 1408. After that, the written record becomes silent. No dramatic final battle, no final speech, no historian describing the last Viking leaving Greenland, just silence. And that silence lasted for centuries. When Europeans returned to Greenland in the 18th century, they found the remains of the old Norse settlements. The farms were still there, the stone churches were still standing in places, but the people were gone. Imagine standing there. You walk through a valley where generations of families once lived. You see the remains of a church. You see walls built by people who crossed an ocean to create a new life. You see fields that were once green with grass, but there is no one there. The society that once connected this remote corner of the Arctic to Europe had disappeared. And perhaps the most important lesson is that there was never one single enemy. It was not simply the cold. It was not simply hunger. It was not simply the Inuit. It was not simply the collapse of trade. It was not simply climate change. It was everything together. A changing climate weakened agriculture. Economic changes reduced the value of their most important export. Longer and more dangerous hunting journeys increased pressure on the population. Trade with Europe became increasingly unreliable, and a society built around farming and European connections found itself living in an Arctic world that was becoming harder to control. The Vikings had survived enormous challenges before, but this time there was nowhere left to expand. The ocean was behind them, the ice was ahead of them, and the world they had depended on was changing. So did 10,000 Vikings really disappear without a trace? Probably not. The truth may be even more interesting. They left traces everywhere, in abandoned farms, in church ruins, in animal bones, in soil layers, in ancient DNA, and in the walrus tusks that once traveled from the frozen waters of Greenland to the workshops of medieval Europe. Their disappearance was not a single mysterious event. It was the slow collapse of a society that had survived for almost 500 years at the edge of the known world. They crossed the Atlantic when most Europeans believed such journeys were almost impossible. They built farms where farming barely worked. They hunted in seas that could kill them. They created churches at the end of the world. And for centuries, they survived. Then the world changed. And the Vikings of Greenland could not change with it quickly enough. Their story is not simply a mystery about people who vanished. It is a story about how even the strongest societies can disappear when the environment, economy, and the world around them change at the same time. The ruins remain, the people do not, and somewhere beneath the soil of Greenland, the final chapter of their story may still be waiting to be discovered.